talking about my first realization that came as a result of seeing the similarity between adventure video games like Halo, also games like Fable, that is role-playing games, and games like World of Warcraft and Lord of the Rings Online, massively multiplayer online role-playing games, the similarity between them and Homeric epic in the way that both of those kinds of storytelling are participatory and can't be done the same way twice, the same way the bard can't sing a story from the Iliad or the Odyssey the same way twice, the player can't play a level of Halo the same way twice. And the first point I made, the first conclusion I drew, is that if the Iliad and the Odyssey were good for Greek culture, then we can't say that games like Halo and World of Warcraft are bad for our culture just out of hand. We may find that they are bad, but we need to make that argument and somehow say that the Iliad and the Odyssey are bad, or somehow that Halo and World of Warcraft are so different from these things that they appear to be like the Iliad and the Odyssey that in fact Halo and World of Warcraft are bad. In any case, that's the first and maybe the most general conclusion to draw. But there are four other themes that I want to tease out from my story of realizing that adventure video games and Homeric epic are so similar. And so the second one is that if in fact we can say that the Iliad and the Odyssey did something that we could call a meaning thing, or maybe to be a little more specific, an ethical critique, that is, telling people how they should be and how they shouldn't be by giving them examples in the characters like Achilles and Odysseus and Agamemnon and Hector and Priam and all the great characters of Homeric epic. If the Homeric bards somehow were saying that you should be like this and you shouldn't be like that by putting all of these characters into stories, not that necessarily have morals, but which say interesting and very rewarding things, ethical things about how people should be in the world. If the Homeric epics do that, and the Greeks agreed that they did do that for them, and we agree even today that they can do that for us, that is, do you want to be like Odysseus, and if so, which parts of Odysseus do you want to be like? Is there anything about Odysseus that you don't want to be like? And there are lots of things about both him and Achilles that fall into that category. If the Homeric epics do that, can we say that games like Halo and World of Warcraft are doing the same thing? And are some of them doing it better than others? And what does it mean to us that kids and also grown-ups like me are playing these games and learning lessons, more or less, of an ethical nature? So theme number one is if the Iliad and the Odyssey are good, maybe Halo and World of Warcraft are too. Theme number two is this possibility of ethical critique within games like Halo and World of Warcraft. What are we to do about that? How are we going to figure out how to kind of nail that down and talk about it? Theme number three is the idea that if by studying the epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, we can figure out more about how Greek culture worked in the period when the Iliad and the Odyssey are coming into being through the bardic tradition, if we can look at the Iliad and the Odyssey and see information, if you will, see what's going on in that culture in archaic Greece somewhere around 800 BCE, then what can we learn about ourselves and our own culture and what's going on in our own world through looking at video games? And how does the, if you will, triangulation between us and the video games and Homeric epic, or maybe I guess the quadrilateralization, if you want to add in ancient Greek culture, how does that help us figure out more about ourselves and again what we should do and what we should talk about with regard to video games? So that's number three. Theme number four is the idea that now that we see video games within a broad span of culture that goes all the way from archaic Greece, call it 800 BCE if you want, all the way to 2008 BCE, now that we see that there's a continuity instead of a kind of radical break that's created by this new thing, the video game, we can, I want to suggest in this course, have a new kind of conversation about video games. we can start talking about what we should do with regard to them in a new way. And we should start making other comparisons between what we're doing in video games and what's going on in culture and what is going on in culture in the same way. How is it that video games can interact with what we're doing, say, in the political sphere or in the economic sphere, rather than just separating them off as this thing that kids do and maybe a few defective grown-ups do? Can we say that, in fact, video games are a vital cultural practice? Can we have that kind of conversation? So that's number 4. And number 5 is something that kind of comes off of the comparison between adventure video games and Homeric epic, that has to do with the way that epic found its way into the cultural conversation, specifically in the city of Athens in the 5th century, that is the 400s BCE. Because eventually, the way that the Athenians were treating Homer in various stories and myths that had come out of Homer in things like tragedy, that begins to enter a new kind of conversation in Athens when people like Thucydides the historian, and above all Plato the philosopher, the very first philosopher within a lot of different ways of looking at it, start to think about what it means that Homeric epic and its offshoots have been so important in the culture of Athens up until their time. Above all, what it means that those have been the mainstay of Athenian education for so long. And Plato especially starts to analyze that and gets unhappy in very much the same way that a lot of people are unhappy about video games these days, about the incredible importance of Homer to Athenian culture and to Athenian education. And he starts to theorize about it and comes up with a new version of a concept that had been around, but which in Plato's words and Plato's thought becomes a hugely important concept for Western civilization as a whole. And the word that he uses in Greek is mimesis, which is sometimes pronounced mimesis in English, or sometimes even pronounced mimesis. And after Plato has a very long history within the study of Western culture all the way up to our own times. And it continues to be a really important concept because it gets at the heart of what it means to do art. Not just narrative, not just stories, but art as a whole. What does it mean, and this is the way it's usually translated, what does it mean to imitate life? What does it mean that art imitates life? What I'm going to suggest to you towards the end of the course is that maybe we don't want to think in terms of imitation. Maybe we want to think in terms of performance. And if we think in terms of performance, that means that video games are doing something really special and really unique, above all in relation to what the Homeric bards were doing. Now, Aristotle comes along 50 years after Plato and tells everybody not to worry so much. Plato was worried that if you pretended, if you performed as a bad character, you would become bad. Aristotle comes along and says, no, we can pretend to be bad people, we can perform as bad people, we can perform as good people, and by doing that, and also by watching other people doing it, we don't become bad. What we do is learn how to better make the choice between being bad and being good, to do that kind of ethical critique that I already talked about with regard to the Iliad and the Odyssey. So let me see if I can remember these 5 themes, which are going to be the 5 themes of the course. First, if the Iliad and the Odyssey are good, so maybe video games. Second, if the Iliad and the Odyssey developed a kind of ethical critique, or if you want to put it more broadly, a meaning, a kind of cultural meaning, a real cultural significance, then games like Halo and World of Warcraft are capable of the same thing, and what might we think those meanings would be? 3, the idea that we can study the Iliad and the Odyssey to figure out more about the culture that surrounded them, and the way that'll help us figure out more about what's going on with us. 4, the idea that it's possible to talk about video games in a new way, based on the way we talk about Homeric epic, and how that might help us understand our own position with regard to video games and the culture as a whole. And finally, this idea about mimesis, the idea about thinking about what it means to perform as somebody else, or even to do art at all, to create a kind of little world, a little representation of the world that has the kinds of meanings and the kinds of cultural implications that we're talking about with regard to Homeric epic and with regard to video games.